This is tape 2, side 1. I have several questions now regarding your work experiences. What jobs have you had?
Well, how far back do we want to go? Should you want to start with kids' jobs?
Oh, I expect here probably jobs that you got after you graduated from college, because as I recall, you reviewed the kids' jobs a little bit when you were talking about your personal history.
Very good. Well, I have got my college degree in 1933 in June, in the very depth of the Depression, and there was simply no jobs available. The first work I had at all was was on Franklin D. Roosevelt's public programs, WPA, PWA, and so forth, and I lost my eligibility for those because I did not have any dependents. So again, I was out of work for a time. Those that I had were chiefly survey work on streets and performed in the dead of winter. I ran a surveying instrument and did computations in the field. Following that, in October of 1934, I had an opportunity for work as a powerhouse laborer at the North Reading Sanatorium, a TB sanatorium for children. And I leaped at the chance, even though my work consisted of wiping engines, steam engines, scrubbing floors, washing windows, shoveling a tremendous amount of coal, periodically cleaning out combustion chambers under the horizontal return boilers, and the like. It was not a job I was happy with, but I did have opportunities during the 18 months that I held that job to work with carpenters to a slight degree, much more so on piping jobs and on electrical distribution jobs. And as a result, after some years, I was happy that I had it, because we generated our own power. It was a central heating plant for the whole institution. We had our own water supply, so I learned about pumping that and the controls on it. And I worked enough with the electricians and on the piping and in the mechanical end of the deal that I figured I had the equivalent of a master's degree, but I earned it the hard way. I left that job in April of 1936 when there were disastrous spring floods throughout New England, and I sought and obtained work on surveys preliminary to the possible selection of flood control dams and the necessary flood basins. And I worked on those surveys from April of 1936 to just short of deer season in November of 1936. I started as a topographic draftsman, graduated from that to having a field survey party with a plane table, which I never had seen or run before, but I learned, and my actual finished work was drawing elevations and some contours on aerial photographs. That was with the United States Corps of Engineers, and after the surveys were finished, I was retained by the Corps of Engineers and worked a very short time on flood control dam design in the Boston, Massachusetts district. But then I had an opportunity to take a job, the title of which was building inspector, at the Boston Woven Hose and Company, a major manufacturer of mechanical rubber goods in Cambridge, Massachusetts. My job actually put me in charge of the maintenance of buildings, their structures, roofs, windows, all their parts, and of the building services, water supply, sewage disposal, elevators, and the like. It did not include anything electrical. Part of my responsibility also was inspection of fire equipment periodically, in which I checked every week on the condition of sprinkler heads for corrosion. And we had our own hydrant system, and I had to check all the hydrants to make sure that there had been no leakage within the system. And that ran into a variety of maintenance jobs, some large, some small, the largest of which was a concrete repair on a reinforced concrete building, a major structure, which at that time was a contract in excess over $100,000. Was certainly a major job for a kid 25 years old. In early 1938, the rubber business fell flat. They had a paucity of orders. They laid off some production help, and they laid off everybody else they could, including me. I was out of work for a number of months. I was one of the early birds on unemployment insurance. In the fall of 1938, I went back to work on an appointment for a year or two or less with the Corps of Engineers, and began my career with them on the construction of a flood control dam in Pennsylvania. I worked for them for 30 years. My main function for about 25 of those years being as assistant chief of lock operations at the St. Mary's Falls Canal at Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan. And in that capacity, I was assistant in charge of a crew of approximately 200 employees on lock operation, a uniformed security guard, and handled most of the personnel work, and of course shared the engineering responsibilities with my boss. I retired from that in May of 1968 after 30 years and 2 months service, and into as an activity into the presidency of the Michigan Association of School Boards, having served for many years on the Sault Ste. Marie School Board and having been very active in those affairs. I spent several years on school board activities, finally retired from the school board, and my only real employment after my retirement from the locks was at 2 terms of the Michigan legislature. I was a lobbyist on behalf of all the Michigan school administrators.
And what union activity did you have in any of these jobs?
In the year 1942 in November. At that time, I was assigned with the Corps of Engineers to the Jacksonville District Office in Jacksonville, Florida. One noon, the announcement went around that the district engineer had authorized a representative of the National Federation of Federal Employees during their free time at lunch to speak to the employees who wished to go and hear him. For something to do, I attended the meeting. The NFFE representative at the time was Art Grams, Grams, and he spoke to us in general about the function of the NFFE, but specifically at that time he concentrated on the fact that there were bills in the Congress to limit our annual and sick leave earnings, which disturbed me, and of course he exhorted the listeners on that basis to join the union to help strengthen the support of the organization that would be working against that legislation. And that is when and why I joined the NFFE to begin with. I was not active while in the Jacksonville district. I attended one meeting in the evening for something to do and was not unduly impressed. But in November of 1994, I was transferred to the position as Assistant Chief of Lock Operations at Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan. And it was several months before I was able to move my family to the Sioux. There was a very active local of number 32 in Sault Ste. Marie, most of the members of which were employees of the Locks. And living alone until such time as I could get my family there for something to do in the evening, I started attending union meetings. And my interest was stirred, and my voice was heard, and I became active. And of course, my family moved there in the spring of 1945, but that did not alter my union interest. By that time, I was hooked. And in 1946, I was elected first vice president of Local 32. In 1948, I was president of Local 32. Also in 1948 came the biennial convention of the Federation, a national convention. And as president, I was a delegate, and I attended. And I found that conventions were an activity that I really enjoyed, in which I would participate, and at which, even from the beginning, I was showing some ability. As a result of that, at my local activities, to cover those completely, I had only one term as president. It was all I wanted, but I served 5 years following that as corresponding secretary. And after that, for many years, I was a trustee of the local. I was not elected to be a delegate to the convention in 1950, but I was from 1952 through 1966. I was an active delegate and was fortunate enough to act in such manner and to have such thoughts that I became a very much respected and also influential member of delegations. And this led in 1958 to my being elected a national vice president of the National Federation of Federal Employees, which I served for 4 years. And following the 4 years, I was no longer eligible to run because of an executive order published that limited the activity of supervisory personnel in what was in effect a labor union. I maintained activity as a delegate through 1966. In 1964, I was the campaign manager of a gentleman who was elected president, national president of the NFFE, and who was served as one of its great presidents for the following 12 years. Following my retirement in 1968 and my attention being concentrated on other activities, I had no activity in the union other than being an active member, an interested member. But in the early 1980s, being near Washington, D.C., and being curious, I called the national office just to see if there were anybody still employed there whom I knew. I was put in touch with the gentleman in charge of publications, public relations, and that sort of thing, whom I knew from convention experience, and talked with him at some length. He was about to retire, but he asked me if I would be interested in talking to the then National Secretary Treasurer of the NFFE, who was getting more and more interested in the organization's history, and perhaps would like to talk to me about it, since I'd been a long-time member. That was Mr. Abraham Orlovsky, and I told him I would be happy to hear from Mr. Orlovsky. He phoned me. We made an arrangement for future correspondence, phone calls, and so on. And it was some 12 years probably before I ever saw the gentleman. But he renewed my interest, and continued, and his interest grew as historian, until eventually he was elected lifetime historian of the NFFE, and he used me as his chief living source at that time of information about it over a period of many years. because I had had contacts in my early days with people who went back to the founding of the NFFE in 1917. I was invited as guest speaker at the 1994 National Convention. And you remember I had not attended one since 1966. And that renewed my interest wholeheartedly. As I said, I enjoyed conventions, and I enjoyed that one, and I met a lot of people whom I liked, and I made a really good speech, and it was well received. So in 1996, Mr. Orlovsky was not able to attend, he being the president of Local 2 in the District of Columbia. I attended in his place. I had transferred my membership to Local 2 and became a delegate again and was an active delegate. I was well received, respected, and thereafter I attended those similar conventions in 1998, 2000, and 2002, and gained more influence and respect, and thoroughly enjoyed the performance until the current year, 2004. And as I speak, the union has just buttoned up its national convention for this year, and I was supposed to be a delegate but was unable to attend. But I still took enough action through others that I had some influence on the convention.
What work did you have as a child and up through your college years?
Well, as a child, I had no organized work. I did yard work. In the springtime, I cleaned leaves out of shrubberies and cleaned up people's yards and lawns. In the summertime, I cut grass. In the wintertime, I shoveled the driveways. And I had a few years when I worked for a farmer, and I pulled some weeds and worked on haying and things like that. But none of it I really liked, as a matter of fact, but it earned about the only money that I was able to earn. After my last year in high school, for 6 weeks, I was a supervisor in a playground, and that was my summer employment for a couple of years in college. Following that, while in college summers, I worked for the Birdseye Frosted Food Company, which later I think was picked up by General Foods or one of those. But Birdseye was the pioneer in frosted foods, and I spent some interesting summers because I was in the shipping department where orders were made up and boxed to be sent to retailers. So my summer was spent days at zero temperature, wearing a sheepskin coat and having numb fingers.
Were you in the military at any point in time?
I could not get in the military as such, but I have some interesting sidelights because as an employee of the Corps of Engineers and an engineer, I was deemed too valuable for my work as a civilian to be permitted to be taken by the military. So I had draft deferments. In spite of that, I tried 3 times to get into the armed forces with the intention, of course, of getting a commission. I was turned down every time, even when they were scraping the bottom of the barrel in 1944 when they were building up the troops for the invasion of Europe, because ever since my early childhood, I had an acute case of my progressive myopia. I did have, for a few months, a sort of a military status, and this was when I was stationed in Jacksonville. And at that time, they were seeking civilians as sort of glorified watchmen on the docks and on ships docked in the harbors of Jacksonville. So I became officially a member of the temporary reserve of the United States Coast Guard, and I was uniformed. I carried a .45 revolver and a nightstick, and I was trained in the use of the revolver. And for the few months that I was still in Jacksonville, I was a member of that. And I was a member just about long enough that when I had to resign because I was moving to Sault Ste. Marie, I was able to keep many dollars worth of uniforms.
Looking back, what was your favorite job and why?
Well, my favorite job had to be my work at the St. Mary's Falls Canal. And I hesitated on that because I have long felt that engineering probably was not the best career I sought, but I did like it, and I did it very well. And at the St. Mary's Falls Canal, I enjoyed it because I was working, as engineers would say, in the field. I was there where the work was done. It's a little difficult for me to go into details on the function at St. Mary's Falls Canal, and I won't attempt to do so, but it was a marine facility. It was vital in the economy of the United States because without our facility, the iron ore from the head of Lake Superior and the millions of tons of wheat and other grains in the fall would not have been able to reach lower lake ports other than by train. And of course, there never was enough rolling stock on the railroads in the United States to move the bulk of that. It had to be done by ships. It was a very satisfying service, and it was a very important service, as is vouchsafed perhaps by the fact that I was there during the latter part of World War II and during much of the period of the Cold War, and our security necessities were such that every month we had meetings with and were checked out by the local FBI agent and also by the Army counterintelligence person who served that area. And he not only came in to check up as to our needs, if any, and we never really had any, but also he kept us informed about what was going on on the Great Lakes in that direction in general. And both my boss and I and others on the installation were cleared for secret in the official manner of those who needed it in the United States service.
Looking back, what was your most unfavorite job and why?
No question on that one. My most unfavorite job was the year and a half I spent as a power plant laborer at the North Reading Sanatorium. I mean, I was there with one of the best and reasonably expensive educations you could get in the United States of America, and as far as engineering is concerned, in the world. And yet I could find no work in my field, and I was reduced to scrubbing floors and washing windows and shoveling coal. I mean, like 40 tons of coal as part of a day's work. No, I did not like it, but I did learn a lot.
If you had it to do over, would you have chosen another field if you had the training and the choice?
There is some possibility that I might have, because with my later interests and avocations, and I had I think, an unusually effective speaking ability and writing ability, and it's entirely probable that I would have gotten into the field of law. I might have become a trial attorney, and most certainly I would have been active in government and politics.
Now I have a number of questions regarding the start of your union activism. How did you get involved with unions?
Well, I think I pretty well covered that in an earlier question. In fact, I'm sure I did.
Well, then specifically, how did you get involved with the NFFE?
Well, the NFFE came looking for members. They had a reason, I felt, for me to join, and I will have to admit that I never really intended to become particularly active in it. I just felt that it deserved my financial support because its objectives were good for me. My real active involvement came, of course, because, as I have mentioned, I was in Sault Ste. Marie for several months before I could get my family moved up there, and I needed something to do evenings, so I went to union meetings. I found them interesting, I found them challenging, and I began to speak about union matters, and one thing led to another. It was a natural drift for me with my field of interests and my abilities.
Why do you believe in unions?
I believe in unions because of the old saying, in union there is strength. With a group of people, you can do a lot of things that one person or a number of persons acting individually just simply cannot do. It's a logical way for me, and my my opinion of unions is very broad. I consider the American Medical Association a union. I consider a church congregation perhaps in some ways a union. So this is just a natural way to go. In union, there is strength.
How did getting involved in union activity affect your life?
Well, very much, very much. It helped develop abilities that I little realized I had. I had been a debater in high school. I had been in plays. I had been musical to some extent, and I really had what people told me, because I can't tell it by hearing it. I have an outstandingly appealing voice, and I have very considerable writing ability, unusual writing ability, I think. And those, how you have those abilities, are things you like to use. And the union provided a great field in which for me to use them.
Did you ever approach anyone about joining the union?
In a way, I most certainly did. I think I was very influential in that regard. I was not good on a one-to-one basis about picking up members as individual or individually, but I suppose it's fair to state that I became the NFFE leader in the state of Michigan. I was accepted by the other unions in that capacity. And eventually that spread to the Middle West, including the states of Ohio, Indiana, Wisconsin, Illinois, to some extent Iowa, and to some extent Kentucky. I was well known, I was well received. I was asked by various of those states at times to be a speaker on the National Federation of Federal Employee Programs, locals and state federations. I was instrumental in the founding of a state federation in Michigan and served in several of its offices over the years, including the presidency. And I was in demand, when I was free to do so, as I have said, to speak. And on at least 3 occasions in Michigan, I was requested by groups of employees, usually at Air Force bases, which were springing up in Michigan during and after the war, to join with them on their organizational proceedings to found a union. And I would appear, I was at that time National Vice President of the union, and I would appear, meet with the leaders of the group, go and interview the commanding officer, tell him what we were about, give him a copy of the Constitution of the Federation to read, and then talk to him later. Usually this ended up pretty much with the commanding officer on our side. I was given permission to address a group meeting of the employees, of those who wanted to attend, and almost invariably these were well intended. It resulted in the founding of a new local. And I think to this end, I was instrumental in getting members. And I was popular as a speaker, particularly in Illinois on any such occasions, because they felt that I was influential in obtaining their members. There is one point I should backtrack on as a local member, because during a period of years, I was editor of a local publication, a bulletin, which was published twice monthly. And during the period that ran, we probably doubled the membership of the Local 32, which was my local at the time, simply because of the information that went out to those who were not members, and perhaps the touching of their consciences, that because they were benefited by the work of the union, that they should belong to it and support it.
This is tape 2, side B. Let's turn now to some questions on your participation in the life of the union. Thinking back to all the people in the local, what motivated them to join?
Well, I think that originally they joined for the same reasons I did. They had a need for it. They were working under conditions that they didn't enjoy, that in many cases were unjust, so they organized to see what they could do about them. And as is well known, of course, many locals of this sort sprung up throughout the United States and were chartered at that time by the American Federation of Labor, as was Local 32. They still found, however, that with a large number of individual locals, they still were unable to make much of any impression on the Congress and the government administration. So it was proposed and furthered by Samuel Gompers, who at that time was president of the American Federation of Labor, that these individual unions should join and form a national union within the Federation. And they did so. They held a convention in September of 1917 with representatives from some 60 federal employee unions present. They worked out a national constitution, and the National Federation of Federal Employees was born. And federal employees flocked to it because the need was great. The federal government had no retirement act, for instance. There were employees in their 80s kicking around Washington, being hidden by their fellow employees during the day so they could remain on the payroll, because without it, literally, some of them might have starved to death. And the pay system had not been changed since way back in the 1800s sometime, as I recall. And eventually the Classification Act, largely written by and certainly supported by the NFFE, took effect and changed a lot of that. And as I say, the needs were so great that it was a natural. Local 2 in the District of Columbia, within its first 5 years, reached a membership of over 20,000. This was not equally true in other localities because there weren't that number of federal employees there, but it grew and it mushroomed. This tendency of people to join it for that reason decreased, of course, through the years as they received more and more benefits. And actually, in my own experience, which was considerable at the time, as I mentioned earlier, I edited for a number of years a semi-monthly bulletin for Local 32. And I was very blunt in this. I wrote editorials about freeloaders and free riders. I pointed out what the NFFE did for all federal employees and voiced my opinions forcibly that all federal employees should be members and should support it. Well, when I became active in it, purely through circumstances, I was the only one at that installation in a supervisory position who was a member. Who approved of unions, who had any interest in unions. But the fact that I was an able supervisor, respected and liked, and was so blunt in my editorials, there were a few people even came into my office and said, "Frank, I'll join your bloody union. I'm not going to be active in it, but I feel I should belong and pay dues and support it." And we actually, because they read my propaganda, many of them joined for that reason. We went from 127 members when I was first in the local to over 400 members over a course of a few years. And I'm sure other unions had the same experience, as they had people who would do the same thing that I did, because the leadership in a local is just a very few people.
In spite of those reasons for joining the union, a number, I take it, elected not to join. Why not?
Well, there were some, and there always have been, and there always will be, those who say, "I do not believe in unions." With some, it may even pertain to reasons of religion, I suspect, although I would not tag any religion with a stigma, if that's what it is. And with some, they were just too daggone tight to pay the dues.
And I take it that some members dropped out of the union. Why?
Yep, some members did. Well, I can give an example of a very eminent member. From the time of its founding and for many years, the Union Constitution contained a stipulation that it would never organize or participate in a strike against the government of the United States. For reasons of its own, in about 1973, as I recall, when I was not during an active period, the Union dropped those terms from its Constitution. A member who had been a national vice president, national secretary treasurer, extremely active in the District of Columbia area, immediately resigned from the Union. However, that was unusual. Some did it because the dues increased for special reasons starting in the 1970s, and they felt they couldn't afford it. And others didn't attempt to go to meetings, didn't read the publication, never really were wholehearted members, and just let it go by the board. And others, a good many of them, died, so we had a constant attrition. And it was a constant fight not only to recruit and gain new members, but to retain those members that we had. And further, as time went along in the 1950s and 1960s, the NFFE, and there were other federal employees unions that had a hand in this, had obtained a great many benefits. And then we ran into a generation of federal employees whose feeling was, oh, well, we don't need unions. The Congress gave us these benefits. We don't have to worry about them. We've got them. The Congress will take care of us. Well, they were not nearly as correct as they thought they were, but for that reason they would drop out.
What was your local union like?
Well, it probably was unique, as I think most union locals are. In membership, eventually, we had everybody from the GS 14 or 15 area engineer as a member, down to the people who swept the floors and dusted the desks in his building. We had a tremendous variety of categories of employment in there, as this was true of many unions. We included employees of at least 5, maybe 6 agencies, and this again was true in general because the NFFE, and this was one of its greatness, part of its greatness, I think, was open to all federal employees, regardless of category of employment, regardless of level of pay, regardless of everything but the fact that they were federal employees.
And what were the officers of the union like?
Well, the officers varied. I have made this generality, however, in looking back at the history of the local, that the officers at the time, or later on, became supervisors of various levels. I was the only professional engineer who was ever president of the local, but we had a construction. Well, he was a foreman at the time, but he became the construction superintendent, and we had the same type of individual from an Air Force base. And I mention this simply because they were people with leadership abilities, and it takes leadership abilities to be officers. The backbone of any local is the financial officer. He's got to make sure the dues are paid. He's got to keep proper records, or nobody's going to like him. And if he sees that the dues are paid, some of them aren't going to like him anyhow because they don't like to pay him. But in general, I would say that they were dedicated to unionism. They were dedicated to that particular union. They felt that they knew what it did for them. They felt there was a necessity for it, and they knew somebody had to do the work, so they did it, and did it with pleasure. And it takes a small group of that sort to run any union.
What was the management you dealt with like?
Well, this of course varies installation by installation, depending on who the top boss is. The management at the St. Mary's Falls Canal was always open to the opinions of the workers, whether or not there was a union, as a matter of fact. So whenever we felt there was a problem, appointed a delegation to deal with the area engineer, and the delegation went and met with him. He was reasonable. He listened. If the union had a good case, they pretty well got what they wanted, because management does not always know what goes on, and sometimes all they need is the knowledge. And if they had the knowledge by means other than the union, they probably would do what the union asked them to do. But all managements are not reasonable. I'm speaking of the one at St. Mary's Falls Canal, which I was asked. I knew of others which were not like that.
What were the bargaining unit members like?
Unfortunately, I cannot get into that. I was a supervisory employee, and when we had a recognized unit, I was no longer able to hold office in my union at any level. That was what cost me my vice presidency. And all I can tell you is that they were people I knew, they were people who were reasonable. And fortunately, in our situation, the people representing management were of that same kind. What they wanted to do was iron out any difficulties amicably, and they did so.
You've already talked about the composition of your union in terms of the type of members it has. Do you have anything to add in terms of what the union members were like?
Well, they were like almost anybody you know. They were like your neighbors. I mean, well, they were like the mailman, if you like, because your mailman, whether you know it or not, unquestionably is a member of a union. And the guy next to you, although you may never know it, very possibly is a member of a union. They're just people like other people, various greater levels of intelligence and activity, and they're Catholics, Protestants, Jews, Indians, white, black, green, or whatever. I mean, they're just people.
What was the effect of world events, things like the Depression, the New Deal, World War II, Korean War, space program, Vietnam, etc., on your union and government service?
Well, I can't speak for Vietnam because that was after my retirement time. But of course, I became a government worker during the Depression in 1938, and most certainly was still going on. And I can recall Pearl Harbor very well. And from my point of view, the whole federal civil service in a body went from a peacetime to a wartime status almost overnight. And I think because we were government employees, not contract employees, that the response was tremendous. Everybody took that practically in stride. I was working at the time on winding up a civil works job, the construction of a flood control dam. The World War started in December of 1941, as far as the United States is concerned. In September, October of the following year, I was assigned as an engineer, one of the engineers on the construction of a navigation lock at Sault Ste. Marie, which was my first experience there. Here we were cleared for secret. We were under security obligations. Sault Ste. Marie and its marine facility at that time was so important that while the town had a population of maybe 9 or 10,000, there were 15,000 troops stationed there to maintain the security. The whole city was flooded with them, and we were probably the nearest community to be under actual military rule as any community in the United States, regardless of military activities. So we really got a bunch of it early, and that was my true throughout my career. When I went to Jacksonville, Florida, my main function was on seeking manufacturers of materials for the Army or the services, and this was a considerable change, of course, from the ordinary Corps of Engineers functions of rivers and harbors. And I transferred from there back to Sault Ste. Marie, which was still under heavy security. As the war ended and they began to move the troops out of the city, we were required to have a civilian guard, uniformed guard, armed guard, trained guard, and that became a part of the operations branch function because it was an operations function itself. In due time, I was assigned to take a course in security at Camp Gordon at Augusta, Georgia, where I spent 6 miserable weeks. But nevertheless, somebody had to be a security person, and I was elected to be it. During many years at the locks, we had an Army major who was a security officer, nominally in charge of the security and the locks guard, but he left the operation of its function to us, and we handled it, and it was well trained and effective. I was there, I can't recall now when the Cold War started, it was soon after World War II were terminated, and I was there until 1968. We were still undergoing the Cold War activities, and I have a certificate from President Clinton, I think, thanking me for my services during the Cold War, as do many other federal employees. Many of them now retired. The World War II had a tremendous effect. The Korean War did this in this manner. For many years after World War II, we, because of the nature of civil service hiring, we were able to hire only veterans of World War II. And we did so, of course, quite willingly and gleefully, and they've included many local residents. And many of these, because it was a perquisite they could take advantage of, maintained service in the National Guard, for which they were paid, of course, for periodical services. When the Korean War came, almost overnight, some of our employees disappeared because they were in the National Guard. They were subject to recall, and they were in Sault Ste. Marie one day, and almost literally the next day, they were in South Korea. And eventually, after 2 or 3 months, some of them came back on hardship discharges because they had families and so on. That caused us some concern and some problems replacing the attrition at that time. Excuse me.
What camaraderie developed among union activists?
That was tremendous. That was really tremendous. Well, almost with my first convention, and this developed through the years, I met really active and interested and able people, and I built up an acquaintanceship through the union and devoted largely to union activities with many people in Illinois and in the Middle West, but also with some very fine people in California, in the Northwest, Oregon and Washington, in New England and Maine and Massachusetts, in Florida, in Texas, in Georgia, pretty much all over the United States. And these were people with whom I corresponded between conventions, largely about union matters, but they became personal friends, very, very close personal friends. And I maintained lifelong friendships with them, even after our union connection parted for natural reasons.
How did these people affect your life professionally?
Well, as an engineer, I'm not sure that they did particularly, because this was not a meeting of engineers. This was a meeting of public employees of all categories. And to tell you the truth, when I met somebody at a convention who seemed to me a mover and shaker or potentially so, I never even asked what agency you worked for or what his civil service grade. was. My only interest was with him as a fellow union member and what we could do together as union members.
How did these people affect your life personally?
Well, in a number of ways, I suppose. As far as the union is concerned and my activities in it, particularly because for whatever reason I was so well received and respected, and of course this was a personal pleasure to me, and it has certainly affected it that way. The personal friendships that developed from it, of course, were invaluable and and well maintained. I mean, they were just friends, just the same as though you made them in any other way.
Let's turn now to several general questions about your life. What was the most exciting period in your life?
Well, this has little, if anything, to do with unions because I was married to a very fine woman. I loved her deeply. And the most exciting period was the 60 years, 6 months, and 4 days that we were married and lived together and enjoyed married life.
If you could re-experience your life, what would you like to do again that was positive, exciting, and meaningful to you?
Well, the biennial conventions of the National Federation of Federal Employees probably gave me the most satisfaction of any activity in which I've ever participated. I was good at being a delegate. I had ideas. I participated. I was a good speaker. I was respected. I respected many others. And I suppose, in a way, they were an ego trip. But they were really, I think, the most enjoyable activities I ever had. And there were some 14 of them, I believe.
Was that the best part of being in and working with the union, or were there some other things related to the union that you enjoyed as much?
That covers a lot of territory. I enjoyed the building of 32, Local 32, as I was the president and recording secretary and the editor of the publication, because as I've mentioned, we went from a membership of 127 to over 400 during that period. That gives you a tremendous feeling of accomplishment, and it builds your ego because it gives you some indication of your own abilities and what you can do. The same I think was true of other measures. I enjoyed being a national vice president of the NFFE. I was a good national vice president. I was a contributor. I had ideas and I presented them, and they were modified and they were acted upon. And all those things are a great source of personal satisfaction.
What was the most frustrating part or experience of being in and working for the union?
Well, that came down to a matter of personalities, really. And it was because in 1957, it was necessary to appoint a national president to fill the vacancy by the sudden death of the then national president. And one was selected, and he was a fine gentleman. He was an attorney. He was a good housekeeping national president. But in 1961, he was faced with Executive Order 10988. This permitted recognition of local unions and negotiations by teams of local union members with severe limitations on the field in which they could negotiate. But that was the first case within the general field of public employment that a group of employees could negotiate with a group of management people, come to an agreement which was signed and was legal and enforced. The national president of whom I speak had absolutely no experience in the field. He had little little contacts even with what you might call the working people, and he was utterly inadequate to meet and counsel and set up programs to meet this need. And the sad part of it was, eventually, we who were influential felt we had to get rid of him. And it took two conventions to do that. That was the real frustrating period because the National Federation of Federal Employees, by comparison with other federal employee unions, lost a tremendous amount of ground in that period because the other unions were joyfully adding to their membership and helping their members negotiate and have contracts.
If you could relive your life, would you change anything? If so, why?
Well, as I think back on it, and even though I have stated in there that I might have been happier in another field of endeavor completely, my answer to that is no, I don't think I would. And I don't think I would for this reason. I, by good fortune, I got the operating position at the St. Mary's Falls Canal in Sault Ste. Marie at a time when we had two young children, very young children. Later on, we added a third. We were in the same community for their complete education from kindergarten through high school, which I think is important, and which was not possible, of course, for many others in my profession. Engineers are likely to move around ordinarily. I got into the community life, as did my wife. I served 19 years on the Board of Education there and parlayed that up into membership on the Board of Directors of the State School Board Association and 2 terms as its president, which I enjoyed very much. And I was active in many other fields. I was active in scouting. I served in public office. I was on the County Tax Commission. I did many things in community life, and I enjoyed every one of them. And in a manner of speaking, I sacrificed my government career because I allowed myself to get into a dead-end job and then voluntarily remained in it. It was well worth it, both for my family, myself, and everybody involved.
Who made a difference in your life and how?
Well, that's difficult to answer, and I assume the question is aimed at what individuals, and everybody has a number. At the Boston Woven Hose and Rubber Company, I was under the supervision of the plant engineer. The plant engineer was an old-timer who had retired from his career activity, and I suppose was a stockholder in the Boston Woven Hose, and therefore he got the job as a way to spend his time. It was something he could juggle with one hand as an engineer. But he was a very sage man, and he always called me Mr. Heselton. But I learned a great deal from him of the philosophy of living, the professional philosophy perhaps. And this was true of a number of others. I was associated with at least 2 people as a Board of Education member locally who were extremely fine people and who also had my imprint on me. And I think in return, perhaps I left some imprint on them. On the other hand, I should mention, in full justice, of course, that I worked on 2 occasions for supervisors whom I regarded as incompetent, poor at handling personnel. It was not a thoroughly enjoyable experience by any means, but I learned by what they didn't do and what they did do, what not to do.
Do you feel that you made a difference in someone else's life, and how?
I hope I made a difference in many people's lives. And I say this because, as I just mentioned, I served 19 years on the Sault Ste. Marie Board of Education. I never missed a high school graduation. I felt that was my reward for the service. And I could look at those kids as they got their diplomas. And I certainly hoped that by my activities as a school board member, I had made a difference in their lives. I felt the same way about my union activities. I did a lot, and I contributed to the founding of benefits for federal employees, which must have affected many of them. I had some small hand, I like to think, for instance, in the passing of the Federal Employees Health Benefits Act, as did many, many others, but I think I was an influence in that. And for that reason, and perhaps very indirectly, I was. Personally, it's hard to say. When our association with the employees in the lock force, for instance, as I mentioned, there were 200 of them. We were very strict in our granting of annual leave. We couldn't help sick leave, of course, but because we had enough men to go around, we couldn't grant annual leaves for many purposes others could obtain them for during the navigation season because we required that many men on the job. And as a result, because leaves were tight, when they came up with personal problems, many of them came in, and I ended up somewhat as an advisor to many of them. In the cases of runaway kids and family illnesses and almost anything that happens within a family. And
End of tape 2, side B.